Okay, welcome everyone to Kubernetes SIG Apps. My name is Adnan Abdul Hussain. Today's the 28th of January. I'm sharing the agenda into the chat here. If anyone wants to follow along and help take notes, that would be great. So the first thing we have here is the workloads API discussion. So I think there was a previous discussion about updating cron jobs. I'm not sure if we have an update on that, if we have a cap on that. Is anyone on the call able to speak to that?
At last discussion, there was supposed to be a KEP that would be in progress, and that there were a few volunteers, and they were directed to start looking at writing test cases. And there was supposed to be a walkthrough, code walkthrough, but that hasn't been scheduled. That's the last I know about it.
Okay, yeah, Ken, I see you're on the call. I think you are working on the KEP towards that. Do you have an update there? Okay, sounds like we don't have any updates here, or maybe if Ken is around later, he can give an update later.
I'm here.
Oh, hey.
Yeah. So we hope to get something out by the end of this week. Internally, we've been basically a bunch of people have been discussing the CAP. The person who's going to author it will not be me. It'll be Barney, who's a SIG Apps member. And we're trying to get that out as soon as possible. He's just been a little bit distracted by other things. So we hope to have it out by the end of the week.
Cool, sounds great. Thanks for the update. Okay, then we can move on to the demos. So Philip, you have a demo listed here about kubectl Q1 documentation proposal.
Yeah, hi everyone.
Hey Philip.
I'll pull that right up. Let me try and share my screen. All right, are you all able to see the screen I have shared?
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. All right, so yeah, what I wanted to just talk about is in SIG CLI, we're rethinking how we want the CoopControl documentation to look. I wrote a bit of it myself some years ago, and so I accept full responsibility for all the issues with it. So if I'm harsh on it, that's the context. But one thing we found when looking at like some of the books coming out on Kubernetes and stuff is that they are pretty comprehensive and offer like a nice linear approach of being able to learn about a tool. And the Kubernetes documentation itself, I think, has mostly been focused on like the entire Kubernetes project and the APIs a lot. Like if you look at the tutorials, there's a lot of focus on the APIs. So if you go to like, how do I learn everything about CoopControl on the documentation page, you'd go to, documentation, and then the documentation for declaratively managing apps, which is kind of our recommended approach, is actually under overview, and then object management using CoopControl, and then kind of buried under here. And this documentation really hasn't been updated since 1.5, I believe. In fact, I think I looked through the comments on here that I wrote to myself and said this will no longer be true in 1.6, uncomment this and update the documentation. So it's a bit buried, it's a bit out of date, and this is really just focused on one piece of it, and our thinking has changed quite a bit. There's also other documentation under the reference here, which is kind of scattered. It's hard to do a linear read through this stuff. You got this kind of overview with some different things that has useful stuff, but it says common operations here, right? So it's not particularly well formatted. And then you go back, and then there's also a cheat sheet which has some of the same overlapping information, but written by a little bit differently. And then there's usage and conventions, right? So the organization of this thing is not fantastic, and it's hard to do a nice, doesn't look good compared to a book. So we took a stab at saying, okay, what would this look like if we did something like the Rust book, right? If you've looked at the Rust Git book, I think they use their own language now. They put together really nice online documentation for their product. And so in SIG CLI, we're re-envisioning like what could this look like, right? And we haven't really settled on this format yet, although there has been mostly people like it. And most of the feedback we've gotten is yes, move forward with this. But the idea is like you have a nice navigation just focused on CoopControl, right? And separate it out with like nice printing resources, and break out the different ways of printing resources with nice examples and some of the some nice little widgets here on like having the code displayed side by side. And then also like working with containers would have its own section for how do we do some of this stuff instead of just buried in like a cheat sheet, of which is one of several different documents that doesn't explain what's in it. We have a way of navigating this stuff and learning about it. And then also as part of this, we're thinking both, okay, how do we want the documentation to look and feel? What can we do with that? What should it actually say, or what should our product support? Because when you're writing the documentation, it occurs to you like, oh, this is how you create an object. Here's how you update an object. And then you're like, okay, delete's next. And you're like, actually, prune doesn't work well. In fact, we tell people not to use it because there's a lot of pitfalls with using it, and it's a little bit dangerous. So it becomes obvious then when you're trying to write the delete section that, hey, we should really fix this, right? Or waiting, like, how do you know when it's done, right? It would be great if there's a status message that printed out, hey, it's all done and everything succeeded, or no, it's crash looping and we're not going to try and complete this. So using this as a tool to look at, like, how should we be developing our UX so it's a little cleaner. And so that's why at the top it says, hey, there's a feature list for stuff we want to build out here. And then lastly, about documenting stuff that like isn't like specific commands, but like how do you either use this tool or how do you make sure that the other tools you're using work well with this one, right? So there's this building containers section down here that's not like intended to be about like how do you build a Docker container and everything about that. It's more about like, hey, what are the implications of using latest in your images, right? How is that going to impact a deployment rollout? How is that going to impact CoopControl applying it, right? Because you're not going to change the image tag, so it won't do a rollout potentially. Should you use a version like a image digest, right, which is automatically generated? So there's different things around building containers that are important when using CoopControl, and like how do we educate users about those? Same thing with like rolling out changes to multiple environments here. This would be like, how do we go, instead of saying like there's this CoopControl context flag, it allows you to do this, how do we start from like what are the problems users are typically facing and then map those into, here's this feature of CoopControl that allows you to do this better, right? So multiple clusters might be CoopControl context, for instance. Use this flag if you need multiple context cluster support. Multiple environments could be namespaces, for instance, and how do we tell users, like, how do we give, instead of just giving users a box of like Legos and saying, go build a pirate ship, like how do we make sure that both all the Legos to build the pirate ship are already in there, and as writing this documentation, realize, no, not all the Legos are there. So telling people to go build the pirate ship is not a nice thing to do. And two, like, why don't we give instructions to people on like, here's one way to build this thing, right? And maybe it's not exactly what you want and you can change it, but at least it's a starting point to evolve. Questions?
Oh, yes. Hi, Phil. Can you hear me?
Hi, Matt. How you doing? Good to see you.
Good. So your Lego ship analogy and the book analogy, I think they're really good, but they kind of highlight something here, right? That I think is worth talking about. You see, when you write a book, you can write about your opinions, right? And different people will write different books on the same exact topic that share different opinions. So 3 people could all write books on how to write applications in Go, and they could have different opinions along the way on the right things to do. And maybe they all fit with what you should do, but they just get more detailed on opinions and they go different routes. And that's perfectly fine. because they're different books of different opinions teaching different schools of thought. And so that's kind of the difference between the core documentation that we provide, which how far do we want to take our opinions, right? If we want to take them very far, we start looking more like a PAS because we're providing lots of things. And that kind of goes down into the route of the whole idea of the Lego kit. If you're going to go build a pirate ship, right? And you have those pieces, and are you going to have them all to put together? And that would mean we actually create all of those pieces, or we have opinions on what those pieces are and that it should be a pirate ship, right? Maybe you're going to build a castle. Maybe somebody wants to go build a spaceship. But we're actually coming now to opinions to say, we're going to tell you how to build a pirate ship, and that's kind of our standard go. And what does that lead? That you should now start leading to build pirate ships, not castles and spacecraft, right? And that also says we're providing the pieces or recommending the pieces you should use. And so we start going down the road of opinions. And one of the things that I remember from a long time ago was we said Kubernetes doesn't want to have too many opinions because we're not a PaaS, right? Because container management and orchestration has been around for Cloud Foundry, I'll do the math here, 7 years ago, had container orchestration and management on it. It was LXC containers, but it was a PaaS in front. It was very opinionated in what they said. I mean, if you really wanted to hack around, you could actually put another API in the front, break their opinions. It wasn't easy like it is here. And this
I think I get your point.
Yeah, you get my point here.
Can I respond?
Wait, can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
There's like, yes, some books can be opinion pieces, right? So there are types of books where you're attempting to make a persuasive argument and convince your readers of a particular thing. You can also have books that are purely meant to be informative, like, let's say, an encyclopedia or a dictionary or a work of nonfiction where you're describing like state of the art or prior art in a particular subject. And I think the intention with this is to be the latter and not the former. And much like the documentation that we're not maintaining right now, it's a place where authors of features in Kubernetes that are exposed via CoopControl can come to actually like do something constructive to at least say, this is the feature we've implemented and how it's reflected in the CLI and realized in the infrastructure today. And this was our intention for how it should be used. And because it's more of a wiki book than it is like, something that you're authoring and sending out and you're printing, anyone in the community is free to come and add to that. And God, I wish people would come and add to our CoopControl documentation or CLI documentation. I mean, let's be honest, the reason we're here right now is because I don't think it's been updated since like 1.5. So it's not clear where like we do anything. And I think from reading it, and I did take the time to go and read it, the story is just telling us, here's how I walk through each command and do something with the system. It's not saying you have to do it a particular way. It's not being prescriptive in any way. So I don't feel like actually reading through it, it doesn't feel like an opinion piece. It just feels like, here's stuff you can do with CoopControl, which, I mean, to me, I don't see why that's contentious. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I can actually answer that. I can answer why it's contentious. If you don't mind, Phil.
Can I just I just want to like inject some context here. Okay. So one thing about the book, like this was inspired by the Rust book, right? The Rust book wrote their documentation on the language. It's about the format and structure, right? To be able to linearly read through a series of things, right? It's not about like, hey, we're going to pretend that we're just like, it's not about being like really publishing a book of which there are many, and you pick one and then we put our like spin on everything, right? With opinions, like that word is really vague and can mean a lot of things, right? Like the opinions in this document are really about like, if you don't want to hose yourself, here's what you need to do. Like, here's an opinion I've highlighted, right? Like if you're going to run CoopControl Git and pull out fields with JSON, be sure to pin the API and group versions, right? Otherwise, when you upgrade your Kubernetes version and the default Git gets a different version of the API, that field doesn't exist anymore, right? And so now your scripts are broken, right? So that's an opinion, but it's also the like correct way of doing something, right? And
I don't see that as an opinion. That's just saying this will break. That's a statement of fact.
right. I mean,
Can I highlight where I
is
think
not don't break yourself, right?
Yeah, but no, there are opinions here, right? So doing declarative application management outside of the Kubernetes API is an opinion. In fact, a lot of us think of it this way. Somebody said to me, you know, you should manage all of your stuff in Git using a DevOps approach to managing how all of your config should be. And that right there is an opinion. And it gets into opinions, right? So if you're going to manage it this way, what does that do for ecosystem projects like Puppet, Chef, and Ansible, right? Ansible, you can do applications. And so if we say you should be doing this in a approach where you're keeping your stuff in declarative files, you're not just declaring it to the API, you're actually also having those declarative files outside of the API, and this is how you manage it, then what does that say to those other tools? And what does it say to process?
Yeah,
let's level up one more. Let's level up one more level.
Control, there's different opinions, right? Like this is about Coop control.
You're right, but you're not just saying this is Coop control. This is saying how you should do things, and this is where we now interface with the ecosystem, right? And so we want to say it's okay for what?
It's saying how you do things. It's called the Coop control book. It's about how you do things with Coop control.
You're absolutely right, but the Coop control book is saying this is how you manage applications, right? And so a lot of this is perspective on how we engage with the ecosystem. Do we want Chef, Ansible, and Puppet to think this is it's okay for their way to be? And then how does our language and stuff say that? And then we level up, right? Because let's say I have a WordPress app. I've got an app that lets me sign up for WordPress sites, and everybody gets their own WordPress site running in Kubernetes clusters. And based on your config, they get different things, but you all sign up with it for an app, almost like what Automatic does with WordPress. Let's just use this as an example. Why would they go even store anything in a DevOps model to deploy and update things? Wouldn't their application just talk directly to the Kubernetes API to create, update, and do those things? It's a very different way to manage your application. It's kind of the app developer thinking about it, but it's an entirely different process from the DevOps way of deploying things, right? It's just a different model. And so how do we as a project communicate? There are these different ways. There are these different tools. We're not putting an opinion on those Legos. We're saying you can go get Lego kits and you can build lots of things. Some of the parts you're going to get from other people. Some of the things you get from us. And we want to worry about the APIs to make sure all of this works together, rather than saying, here is how you go build a pirate ship with our opinion as part of the project. Because if we go down that road, we start going more down the PaaS road and the opinion road, and that changes our relationship with the ecosystem. And that's
what this isn't about Ansible. Like this is not about how to go build your application. This is about how to use CoopControl, right? Like I don't get, like there are lots of books on.
But CoopControl is being built to add more and more features to do application management. And as it is pushed, if something's the official thing, don't do other things. Like this has happened more than once. And so CoopControl does application management this way. People go out and tell other people, this is the way you do it. And so therefore, this is how your stuff should be. And we've had a problem with this in the past when something ends up in our tools, people saying, this is now the way everybody has to do it. We have an ongoing problem with this.
So yes, I want to say one more thing, and then maybe we can
please
say then maybe we can I'd like hearing like the feedback on how should we evolve this thing. Like the reason I'm coming here, right, and trying to get feedback is like to get input. And so I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts, and then like obviously what we end up doing is going to be determined by the people writing the documentation and showing up and helping give feedback regularly, not just once. So so yes, like please everyone do come to SIG CLI and then help add your opinions on how to write documentation to documentation. Right. That said, like I do think we owe it to our users to tell them, give them the knowledge we have on what we've seen to be most successful. Like when we write this tool, we do it intentionally in a way to say like, this is how we think users are going to be most successful. Like, and if we were to just say like, I don't know, use CoopControl run if you want, or use CoopControl create deployment if you want, or use CoopControl apply, or use CoopControl delete and then recreate. Like, yes, we could like say we're unopinionated about how to use our own tool, and we have several different ways of using our tool, that some of which are more effective than others. But But I don't think that helps our users, right? Like, and I think it helps everyone else to just know how we found using the tool to be most successful.
When it becomes effective, how are we actually looking at how users are effective with application management in it?
I mean, like if you use CoopControl Run, you don't have an audit trail. You don't have a great way of diffing. I mean, there's like table stakes where it's like, oh, that's not a great. We have not found that to be particularly successful. Largely like the developer's own experience running applications feeds into this, right? Where we found being able to audit changes and roll them back to be a useful capability.
Well, yeah, but when I ask this, right, this is, I mean, how many people outside of the core people who work on CoopControl, whose job is to work on it, like how do we go beyond that to actually say these opinions are based on what people are doing? And I know there's work to try to put a survey together and get that out, and maybe that impacts and informs the survey to look at, instead of a small group of people saying, this is how we know to be effective, but to actually look at what are end users finding to be effective.
Yeah, that's exactly my question.
In order to incorporate it in, because right now it's an opinions from a small set of people, and I think that the sample size, especially when it comes to people doing application work, would be really useful to incorporate what are good styles, where are those pitfalls, and what works well.
Yeah, Matt, how can you help us get those people to show up to SIG CLI and make their voice?
You're probably not going to get them to show up to SIG CLI because only a fraction of people, right? They're interested in their app stuff. They're not going to show up to SIG CLI to come contribute, but they'll give you their 2 cents. I think it actually requires doing things like surveys, going out and asking questions of people at companies. So the CNCF has the end user community, which is people who don't produce products but are end users. It's like a specific targeted group, and they're very willing to talk. And so some of the new things that are going to happen is they're going to have forums where different topics, they'll bring end users together and projects can go approach them. There's ways to actually deliver surveys to them and ask them to fill them out. There is a contact, and I've shared her name, I'm forgetting off the top of my head, who handles this, and she's actually organizing the forums and everything. But it's that opportunity for projects to go meet with those end users and engage with them to get their feedback. And I would suggest not trying to get them to show up to SIG CLI. Don't expect people to come to you. Go to them.
I mean, I think both are necessary, right? Like ultimately you said there's a core group of people that contribute to CoopControl, right? And those are the people who are going to probably write this stuff. And every time we have a discussion about something, we can't go write a survey, right? Like we can't, every time we want to write the documentation, update the documentation, we can't write the survey. We haven't updated the documentation since 1.5, right? So there's like a practical, what's possible. And it would be so much more helpful if like advocates, like you don't have to show up and even write the documentation, although that would be helpful, but just having people come by and give their voice instead of us having to reach out each time we went to build something.
I mean, that's the reality of it, right? That's why products and companies have product managers. So the engineers focus on the engineering, and that product manager goes and meets with all kinds of customers to interface with them and to hear from them, because they don't show up to the engineers. There's kind of that liaison thing that just to really understand them has to happen. I know, just to give an example on the Helm side, for years, we've done things where we've sat down with people who work at companies who do massive Helm installs and just listen to them, take notes, ask them questions, literally just have interviews with them over time. In addition, that has been baked into surveys over time to try to gather information as well. Like, well, Helm was still part of Kubernetes, and we did the last apps one. We had a whole section where we captured what kinds of questions did the project want to ask in order to put that on to users to learn more. And we learned some really interesting details from that, but we have to go out to them in order to get it because they just don't come by. That's the reality of it.
Are you like, so how do, like, without asking all of the existing engineers to turn into product managers, like how does the project help us with this, right? Like, I don't know, it's an open question, right? Like, there's not been strong SIG PM.
I look at this very differently. So, I mean, like there are many Kubernetes products, but core Kubernetes is an open source software solution that you can take and go build your product on top of if you want to. So I'm really looking at this as what's good for our users. What's not good is having documentation for CoopControl that's like goes back to 1.5 or 1.6. My measure for like whether they're satisfied with it or what needs to be done generally comes from GitHub and Slack. And I think back to like so back in the day, there was no like SIG CLI and SIG apps. And like, even up until like my time, mostly the CoopControl documentation and a lot of the implementation was contributed by developers who were also working on the back end infrastructure. You go, you write your features in your controller, you add code to CoopControl, then you expose it, and hopefully you document everything well enough. And I think that's evolved and that's changed a lot. And now you have people who are dedicated like 100% to the CLI for all features. And there's a lot of work, a lot of interesting work going on right now to get CoopControl out of tree and to fix the dependencies on internal types. And like there's a lot moving on right there. So I just don't want the context of these features to get caught or get lost. And like there's a lot. So I mean, when people implemented this stuff, there were opinions. It was implemented with specific use cases in mind. And I just don't see how it's hurtful, at least to start with capturing the use cases that the authors of the original software, you know, intended with it. If nothing else, that's informative to the end user about what the intended use case was. And growing from there to add other use cases and add the opinions or add, you know, to enhance it with other viewpoints, that's great. But to say that we should do nothing because we haven't, I don't know. I don't see how that helps anybody. Like, I just feel like that's not a service to our users.
Please realize I'm not suggesting we do nothing by this. I think there's a lot of fantastic material in here. It's when you get into some of the opinions. And I think, you know, we touched on it before, building containers or rolling changes out to multiple environments, right? That very easily gets into certain opinions. Is it a push-based rollout? Or do you have something in the cluster doing a pull-based rollout like Weaveworks Flux, right? That does things differently. All of these end up being opinions. And the way this is written up, whether it's talking about the tools CoopControl applies or having an opinionated process, influences things. And then there's the way people walk away from this saying, well, CoopControl says this is how you do it, so those other ways are wrong. And we shouldn't say that this kind of thing doesn't happen because people do it. And I mean, earlier this year, I shouldn't say earlier this year, sorry, earlier last year, about a year ago, somebody approached me about wanting to get a project into Kubernetes SIGs in order to make it the de facto way to do things to stop the other projects in the space. And so when we talk about positioning and thought around this and using it, people definitely use it. And so while I think, you know, the opinions are it's great to have opinions out there, how we handle this as something that's part of Kubernetes, the project, and the way we interface with the ecosystem matters. And we have to think about how some of those actors are going to take things, right? And so when I look at opinions, right, how would you go out and roll changes to multiple environments? There's multiple opinions on that. And there's multiple tools implementing those multiple opinions. And I want to make sure that I would really like the Kubernetes project not to stunt the area by the way people take something and engage on it. And I don't think anybody has that intent here. I think we've got the best case analysis out of the people that I know, and we're all talking here. We got the best case intent. It's other people and other ways things end up going that just cause things like this. And, you know, it was beaten into me very early into Kubernetes that Kubernetes is not a PaaS. We don't want to have too many opinions like PaaSes of the past do. And so that's where I get very wary when we start going down the road of too many opinions, because you know, that does go down that PaaS road of our opinions or a select groups of opinions. And that's always been baked in very early on. We don't want to do that. And so that's where you're going to see my concern coming in, not to document what's here very well. It's where we start layering in opinions, and maybe we don't even realize where our opinions are.
We have to be concrete about what opinion means, right? Like, because what's an opinion to you may not be an opinion to me or someone else, right? And if we start saying across the project there's a, you know, a mandate that no opinions or restrictive opinions or that sort of thing, like, well, is telling someone to use the -- context flag to specify the cluster, is that an opinion? Because that's not the only thing you can use the context flag for, right? But you can use it for it. And if someone was to ask me, well, how do I roll out changes to one cluster and then another cluster? I'd say use the context flag, right?
Yeah.
So the only way
like, is that an opinion or not, right? Like, I don't know. And if we just say opinions are bad, then like we can't have solid technical questions about this sort of thing.
You're right. It's how far those opinions go. Like suggesting that, the way to do multiple environments is to do it this way, and here's how you use the commands to do it, versus here's how you can use commands for different things. And a lot of it is in the language we use and in how we do it, instead of saying, this is how you solve multiple environments, versus here's ways you can use CoopControl to interact with multiple environments, right? One closes the door to others and says, this is how you do it. And another says, here is how this Lego works.
Yeah.
Can, should versus must, right? There are different things, but I think my overall point is just basically like, the only way so documentation in open source is one of the hardest things to get done, right? Because it's a contribution that many people don't actually want to make. And I've seen not just our projects in our community, but in many open source communities, constant calls for, hey, you want to start out, documentation is a great place to start because we don't have it. And here's a place where we know we're lacking. For open source contributions, the only way that I've seen things be successful is to get someone to make an initial contribution. And if it is slightly controversial, or if many other people have opinions, then they're always welcome to contribute on top of that, and we can solve it as a community, and we can incorporate the viewpoints of all of our members. Like, I don't see why having this format versus the existing format, which isn't very discoverable, to add another criticism to it, would restrain that. And that's just my viewpoint, right? So like, if the entire community feels like this is not the way to go, okay, I'm not going to be like super opinionated on that either. But I just think that it's great that there's a solution here, and Doc seems to like it. It's definitely better than what I've got today, and I'm just glad that somebody's willing to step up and add some documentation to kubectl so that it reduces the number of open issues we see and Slack pings we get and all of the above for how to do these things with the tool.
So let me share an example, and it's not somebody here that is on this call actually shared with me, but it was that I've been told that the only way people should do things is declarative, right? And that declarative isn't declaring it to the API, it's also in how you store it outside of the API, that you need to store it in Git or version control, but primarily Git, and you have to have it declarative there. And then that config needs to then be pushed into your clusters. And then you override it for different environments using customizations. And that's the only way people should do it. And the Kubernetes documentation should reflect it, because the other ways are inferior and wrong. Now, this has been expressed to me by more than one person on the project, and that's a very strong opinion, right? And so without getting into even my opinion, one of the things is, because that is a very strong opinion on how you engage with Kubernetes, and it doesn't work well with the ecosystem, right? I'm inclined to say that's the kind of opinion that should not be reflected in our documentation, but I know there are people who would like to see that reflected in our documentation. And that's the must case. And I really want to make sure that we don't do that when there are people who hold a strong opinion, so that way we play well with people who have many varying different styles in the cloud native space, because we're going down the road, if we went that way, of very strong opinions. And we're not just doing that, we're telling people who interact with our API how they should build their applications to interact with the API and how they should do their workflows. And so, right, these tools, whether somebody uses Jenkins or Chef or Puppet, people are really opinionated on those, right? Like far beyond sometimes the Vim versus Emacs debates. And now we're coming in with an opinion on how they should do things. And that to me it makes me nervous, and it's kind of confining and restricting to what we're telling them to do. And so that's the case that I'm really honestly trying to stop against, because there are people who want that.
So I think like this has been a great discussion. I doubt we're going to resolve all of this here, and I'd actually like to get this has been a great high level discussion. I'm actually really interested in like concrete discussion about like each item, like literally each sentence of the documentation and each subsection, and saying what should we say about this. And Matt, like you have suggestions about like wording where maybe the information is exactly the same, but the sentence structure indicates that this is how you use CoopControl in order to achieve a specific task, rather than here's how you do it in Kubernetes or something like that. So maybe if anyone Matt, I know you're very busy, but if anyone else shares like your perspective or could help build this documentation with us, we could have more discussions continually.
So, a quick question here. Phil, this is a Git book that is published through, I see Firebase here. If somebody were going to have opinions on it, fork it, want to contribute back to it, how does this fit in with the Kubernetes documentation, direction, pull request flow, all of that?
Excellent questions. No one has approached me yet offering to help. I think I am totally open. I've been asking a lot of people for help. Everyone's like, yes, I will totally help. So I pushed it to a branch on CoopControl repo just as a place for anyone to play with it. Like you do exactly the things you said, and no one has really engaged me about it. So I kind of stopped updating it. I'm pretty open to anything. If we could, that's like if a number of people are interested, like doing a CoopControl branch. And just pushing it there and updating, like, and then everyone hosts it. It's just a static.
So can I ask a question? So as the work continues to move CoopControl into Kubernetes as opposed to Kubernetes, do we picture having a documentation like section that's for Kubernetes right?
Yeah, excellent question.
Yeah.
I've talked with the docs folks and we've kind of gone back and forth with it. And then there's so like the discussion has kind of been like, what do you think of like a linear structure about CoopControl? Again, going back to the like, not just like cheat sheets and that sort of stuff, but like one section on this that is also meaty enough that it warrants having its own nav kind of. And there's been the idea of like, hey, maybe having like a book section on the doc site has been kicked around. I kind of asked for it and said, hey, like we have tutorials, we have concepts, we have all these different things, but like, you know, what do you think of like another section that's just like, here's everything on tooling or CoopControl or APIs or whatever it is. And that's really only in an idea phase right now. So potentially we could have something like this on the main site. The other ideas that have been suggested are take this content and put it on the Kubernetes site under concepts or some other place. The docs folks have been leaning away from that and leaning towards like, why don't we just keep this as its own separate site? That way SIG CLI can maintain the documentation. It's less work for them. We get to keep kind of the things we like about it while we experiment and figure out like, how could this live on the main site? Or how well does this work on its own? And so I think the plan right now is to just link out to this page from the main Kate's doc site and say, here is documentation on CoopControl if you want to learn about how to use the tool. But again, open to anything. Go on, Matt.
I have a couple of thoughts. First, I think as trying to figure out the initial content, this is probably a good idea. And the way that CoopControl can approach this will probably help other projects that may want to go this road, like Minikube or Dashboard or something like this, that can have separate release cycles, also have their own documentation that is in a nice structured form for their thing, which I think would be useful for people who are trying to figure out how to use that particular part. But I would like, so one of the things by keeping it its own structure is the multilingual workflow they're building in with the other communities like China and Korea. And so we're going to eventually want to get that in because there's a lot of non-English speakers who are engaging with this stuff, and they have figured that out. So they either need to figure out how to bring it in here. And for anybody wondering, by the way, this is Gitbook. Gitbook actually does multilingual. So that is something, if we did want to bring it over here and could work with the workflows, would happen. But it's just one of those things to keep in mind and work out. I like the docbook format for this. I like it actually better than Kubernetes docs for this kind of navigation and thing. So at least that's my 2 cents, and I would start off here. I would, Phil, where is this branch? We had the question here. And
Sorry.
And so got somebody here to ask. I looked at the CoopControl repo and I couldn't tell what branch it was.
That's a great question. Do you mind if I do that? Would you mind if I update the notes with that? Like I think like.
Please, yeah.
It may have been, because I need to make sure, it may even just be in the, I think I might have merged the main branch back in, yeah, it looks like I have. So I'm not sure how update this is. There's the, I just posted a link to where the code exists that's been merged back in the main thing. Nothing's really happening with this right now, but some folks wanted to get it actually in the main master. So there it is.
So this is where people could do pull requests and everyone can work off of now?
Why don't we do this? Why don't I go make sure that my changes are reflected here first, because I made a lot of them, and then yes, let's say should I send out an email when I've done that or something?
Yes, please do, because you've got at least one person, and then maybe myself who's interested in docs who might come poke at this. And if we can do pull requests, and of course this will bring in the CLA and everything nicely. It's a great way to help get, and we can start talking and pointing people over to this and say, go, you want to contribute to better docs on this stuff? Here's where you go.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, I'll send an email to SIG Apps, and I'll try and make sure the pull request is open by end of day.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Philip.
Okay, I'm gonna. Can I just do a quick thing on the future? I think I had the follow-up topic too. I don't know if I've totally derailed your meeting here.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, and
Yes.
we can get to PS demo at the end.
Okay, I'll make this quick. So I just also wanted to talk about like the vision for CoopControl in 2019. I know that like what CoopControl does impacts a lot of people in SIG Apps, and so just understanding like where our priorities are would probably be helpful to everyone, and then allow you to come talk to us if you think like there's something we can do that related to these. So the first is better version skew support. This is something I think is really important because it impacts the correctness of the tool, and also allows people to get like some of the latest features and bug fixes in CoopControl for later, even if they have like later releases of the Kubernetes server, right? So you may want to upgrade your client at a faster pace than the main server. It's going to be important when we move to a separate release cycle. So if we decide to start releasing more frequently, version skew will be more important. So I'd like to have every version of Kubernetes that's currently supported or still getting patch releases and that sort of thing be supported by the latest version of CoopControl, the latest release, which is not the case now. So that's something we really want to see. Moving Kubernetes, the CoopControl code into its own repo so that it can be built separately and eventually have its own release cycle is on there. This will also help with making sure that things in CoopControl can be exposed as libraries a little more easily. After that, it's like extension mechanisms to support the APIs. So there's two types of extensions we talk about. There's like how do we extend the CLI surface area itself with new commands and that sort of thing that are totally bespoke and unrelated to APIs, potentially, right? That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is like server-side printing. How do we make sure like CoopControl rollout status is this command that will tell you about like the status of your deployment rollout, but it won't tell you the status of whatever thing you built in your CRD. So how do we make sure that all of the commands we support work natively with CRDs, as well as commands that are bespoke to APIs, such as CoopControl create config map, for instance, creates a config map API. Like how can we make it so it's possible for you to get those in, get those same sort of commands for your CRDs without having to go publish a binary, right? How can we make it so that like you just provide the YAML, for instance, or the JSON for the API that CoopControl create, your type should create, and then you provide flags that then go customize or change the what's created. So supporting those, and then the next thing down the list would be like extension mechanisms for other stuff, like what do people want to do with plugins? What do people want to do with other things? Like the feedback we've gotten on plugins has kind of been all over the map in terms of what people want with them, but the biggest ones are discovery and creating things for CRDs, in which case we can probably support that using the mechanism I just talked about. Much simpler, in a simpler way for everyone. Plugins for more advanced things that aren't related to APIs, but maybe processing of files locally or something like that would still need to be done as binary plugins. But why you'd want to do that is something we're trying to like understand. Because if it's just about like it being under the Coop control path, like how much value does that add? Something we don't really know, right? We don't have a package distribution management system, so you're really just getting an alias for the command. All right, that's our vision. So it's mainly focused on making the tool more solid for what it already does.
So Phil,
Yeah.
I have two things, two thoughts anyway. First, around the version SKU support. So the last app survey we did, which was almost a year ago now, bordering like 10 months or something like that. One of the sad things that we discovered was that the clusters people were using, many of them were past the supported release cycle, right? The reality is there's a whole lot of that going on. And just to think about that in the version queue support, to say, you know what, as long as the APIs haven't changed, we can make it work with that. Because quite frankly, I mean, if somebody's using like Homebrew on their Mac, right, and they just upgrade the Kubernetes CLI, they're going to have the latest, and then they're running clusters that, heck, maybe are still running 1.9. There's totally a lot of them out there still. Don't get me started on it. It's the reality of the situation, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing would be just something to think about in the version SKU support. And then the other part is with plugins and extensions, right? You talked to me about the Unix philosophy a while ago for this stuff. It might be worth documenting that somewhere to say, you know what, if you want to do things, CoopControl is meant to work with the Unix philosophy. So you can, you know, export and maybe do things this way where it sends to standard out maybe your YAML file. And if somebody wants to deal with binary paths or something inside, it can be piped through. We talk about, because in that case, we don't have to know all the different ways people are going to do stuff with it. We actually just talk about here's how you can engage with it. So we don't have to know, but here's how you can do that with the Unix philosophy. That may even be something that's useful to put in the doc book you're doing.
Yeah, the latter, yes, that's a good point. Actually, maybe if we just tell people like, you know, like here's all the ways you can interact with CoopControl, whether you do a plug, you can do these with a plugin or without, right? It doesn't really matter. That's a great idea. I can add that to the documentation as well. I think that would be helpful. The version SKU support, I completely agree, right? Like, you know, the APIs do change. Like we drop open API support for one, or rather, sorry, we didn't drop it. We changed the version of open API we were using and then dropped the old one, right? And so these things do change. So that doesn't mean we can't support the versions, right? Like we could leave the support for the old ways and for a long time. Server-side printing is good. This is going to happen again, right? Where we're moving the printing into the server side. We are going to want to take it out of the client side at some point. When we do that, it's going to stop working for all the APIs that don't have that server-side printing yet. I would like my pipe dream, right, is to just draw a line in the sand and say, every CoopControl version from here on out will be backwards compatible with this API version, like forever, right? Whether that's realistic or not is another question. But yeah, getting more than just the supported versions would be great too. Right now, we don't do all the supported versions, so.
Right, I was going to say, like, let's walk before we run, right? Like,
yeah, okay.
But yeah, I agree. Like that's why it's at the top of the list too. It's an ambitious thing. It's going to be hard. It's going to take us some time to really get it where we want it to be. But I think we can start with at least all the versions of Kubernetes we support.
No, I think so. This looks good here. And folks, everyone who's listening, so I've talked a lot. If folks want to go help contribute to some of these things that they've talked about here, Phil would love to have contributors over there helping.
We actually have really experimented with different sorts of mentoring and helping people contribute, and a lot of people actually start there and then do some stuff and then go to some other project that they find to be more in line with their interests. But we are very friendly. Although it's serious, I've been told that we're serious. We don't use enough emojis in our Slack channels, but we're still nice people.
So, Phil, just a thing that I realized, we posted to the discussion board. George would know the right location in there, that we were looking for people to help with cron job, and we brought it up at the community meeting that we wanted people to contribute, and we got a whole bunch of people who said, yes, I want to help with that. Let me get involved. So the next time you go present there, I would really suggest pressing that and maybe putting something up there to help you get more people to help you with these things, because I know you could use more help.
Yeah, fantastic. That's great advice. I'll make a note of it for our next update.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so finally, Pierre, do you want to take the floor
Yes.
with the portable resource definition?
Great. So if we take back the Lego analogy, I think we will be discussing about the camera. And my son has a nice Lego box, and you know this camera that fits in the hand of the Lego people. It's not that the obvious building blocks you need, but sometimes. Okay, so there was a CAP about portable resource definition. And yeah, I gave it another name, standard resource definition. So basically the idea behind it would be to have, yeah, so the custom resource definitions, but a list of standard one living upstream. So yeah, let's try to start with that. So I will speak about the use case. Yeah, okay, let's go. So for me, the use case is as a package maintainer. So I created, for instance, the Helm template for Rocket Chat. It's not the best one, probably the worst one, but still. And previously, I contributed some Docker official images, and I'm looking at maintaining packages for Kubernetes for open source applications like Nextcloud, WordPress, Matomo, Discourse, and these kind of things. And the problem I see with Helm templates is that, so basically, if you take your the WordPress example, you need a MySQL database. And various organizations have various ideas of what is a MySQL instance. And what you see in the field is that people don't use the vanilla upstream Helm template. So the official charts are merely documentation to be forked. And I think this is really sad. And that's why maybe the quality of Helm charts is not, official Helm charts is not really to the best. And people are not much contributing, but yeah, it's just one idea. Yeah, and so this is the reusability issue. And the second thing is in the multi-cloud deployments. So for instance, OpenShift is working on having things to be possible to be deployed on Azure and Amazon. And so as an app developer, then you say, I need a MySQL database. And Amazon has a different idea of what's MySQL database than Google Cloud. And so the idea for me to solve this problem would be to have a repo, so that would look like this, kind of, so standard resource definitions that would live upstream, ideally, with a bunch of folders. And so maybe one for PostgreSQL, one for what is a kind of S3 bucket. And I watched the SIG Apps meeting from last week about cron horizontal pod autoscaler, and you were discussing like, yeah, this is great, this is a great controller, I'd like to share it around, but we don't really know how. And so maybe if the CRD itself would live here and then reference the implementation, then it would be one way of doing, and then other things. But to start with, for instance, the PostgreSQL, I don't know if you saw what Crossplane did, and I think it's really nice. So there is a kind of indirection. So this is how it looks like in Crossplane for Postgres. So basically, you have one CRD that is like PostgreSQL instance, and then you have a direction referencing a resource class called Cloud Postgres. And then this is how it looks like. So this is a Google Cloud PostgreSQL compatible API. But you could have also the same that would look like this, which is like the local PostgreSQL, and the implement detail is based on Cockroach. And so then it's up to the cluster administrator to decide what is the local Postgres or cloud Postgres. But the user itself or the package maintainer, I could use this PostgreSQL resource that would be standardized inside the Kubernetes upstream. And me then, as a WordPress developer package maintainer, I could use this object then. So this is one example. I will not go through the backup one. The apps binding one is interesting because this is like the standard way that apps code came up with to basically do the service catalog binding. But I will not detail that because I don't have time. And yes, so everything here looks really like service catalog. So how to create an instance and how to delete an instance and how to bind to it. But for me, service catalog has too much limitations. So for instance, day two operations. So if you take the example of MySQL RDS running on Amazon, what if you want to take a backup? So this is not planned on the service catalog. So basically you need an operator anyway. And there are many things around day two and day three operations. Another thing is watch resources. So the nice thing about controller is that the controller enforces the state, whereas the service catalog is just about deploying or creating an instance of it, but it's not really watching this. How do you update a resource? This is part of the service catalog API, but not maybe, like for instance, in the service or catalog from Amazon, not implemented yet. And the portability service catalog doesn't have a definition upstream of what is a PostgreSQL instance. So yeah, I'm not sure we have time for comments, but I can stay in the call. And so this is it. So
Yeah,
then, the
sorry.
question is, how can I move this forward? So what's the, I'm totally new here.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that and welcome. So I think we're a little bit out of time right now in this call, but maybe it's a good idea to follow up either in a mailing list or even in that in PR for that KEP.
Yeah, I created an issue because it was backported from a previous repo. I created an issue, and this is what I shared in the Google Doc.
Yeah, so I was the one who was carrying that KEP forward. So I'm happy to chat about it. There's some other considerations we have. In fact, I've got some changes to propose to the KEP as well to make it more like PVs, PVCs, and storage classes. But one of the things like we have to deal with is if you're WordPress, right, and something the service catalog doesn't deal with is give me a standard way of getting the database credentials out. So if I deploy it in Azure or I deploy it in Google Cloud or I deploy it in AWS or on-prem, what?
Did you see this blog post from Apps Code about app bindings?
Yeah, and how do we do that, right? I'll have to go read up on it. Unfortunately, I have not had the chance to read through all your work. I just got, but that's one of the things that we need to figure out here. And so the idea was actually in Kubernetes to have a catalog of all of those CRDs per thing, and then also include the closed loop secrets where it needed to be with a schema. And instead of the type being opaque, you can have a specific type and tie that back to the project so you can have different controllers from different people that do different things. That was the intent of it, and to close the loop on all of this. So I think we're thinking along the same lines, and this is probably a good chance maybe for us to either get together this week or continue this conversation in SIG Apps next week to progress this. But I probably want to do it sooner than next week. I have time.
Do you go to FOSDEM?
No, I will not be there.
Okay. Okay, I will try to come next week then.
Okay, yeah, and I'll try and get a hold of you on the mailing list because you've already started this conversation, and we can do some talking this week.
I think that would be great. And if anyone else is interested in this as well, they can get involved through the mailing list. Okay, sounds good. I think that's all we have for today. We're a little bit over. Thanks again for coming, everyone, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.